When Grace stepped through the heavy wooden doors of the massive estate, she could feel the weight of silence hanging in the air like old wallpaper. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor, the sound swallowed by endless hallways. She adjusted the strap of her worn leather bag and took a deep breath. Grace had cared for dozens of patients in the past, but something about this assignment felt different. The agency hadn't said much, just that the woman was elderly, quiet, and very rich. But that wasn't what had caught Grace's attention. It was the final note. She hasn't spoken a word in 5 years. The housekeeper, an older woman named Marta, greeted her coldly and with suspicion. "You'll be in room east, next to her. Don't wander, and don't ask questions." She didn't even look Grace in the eye. The moment Marta opened the door to the patient's room, Grace's heart dropped. The woman was frail, skin like parchment, silver hair braided back neatly. She sat in a rocking chair, eyes focused on the rain sliding down the window, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't turn when Grace entered, but her breathing subtly shifted. Someone had noticed. Grace didn't speak either. She simply walked over, knelt, and gently placed her warm hand over the cold, wrinkled fingers of the woman. There was no reaction. Still, Grace smiled softly and whispered a tune her grandmother used to hum, a lullaby with no words. Just a melody wrapped in sadness and peace. Grace didn't know it, but in the shadows of the hallway, a tall man in a crisp black suit had paused, watching, and something in him stirred for the first time in years. The elderly woman didn't speak, didn't flinch, but the rhythmic tapping of her thumb against the armrest slowed, Grace noticed. She continued humming, her voice barely audible, letting the melody wrap around the silence like a warm blanket. The woman's eyes remained fixed out the window, but Grace could swear they blinked slower now, though they were no longer seeing rain, but remembering something distant and sweet. From the hallway, the man in the suit kept watching. His name was Elliot. The woman in the chair was his mother, Eleanor. For years, Elliot had thrown money at caretakers, specialists, and therapists. None had stayed longer than a month. They all gave up. But now, this woman with braids and a gentle voice had arrived, and already something looked different. He didn't believe in sentiment, not anymore. Yet he lingered behind the wall like a boy afraid to be seen. Grace turned and saw nothing, just a hallway and shadows. Still, she felt a presence. She gently pressed a kiss to Eleanor's papery hand and whispered, "You're not alone. I'm here." That night, Eleanor's breathing was steadier. For the first time in 5 years, she closed her eyes peacefully. Grace stayed beside her until dawn. Grace settled into the east room quickly. She hung up a few pictures, pinned her grandmother's rosary to the wall, and played soft vinyl records on a second-hand player she brought with her. Eleanor never spoke, but Grace never stopped talking. She told her stories of the cat that used to steal her socks, the Sunday dinners that smelled of garlic and love, and the dreams she had before life forced her to grow up too fast. Each evening, she sang. Songs from long ago, lullabies that had no words, spirituals filled with longing. Her voice carried through the hallways, like a ghost comforting the living. The mansion, once cold and silent, started to hum with quiet warmth. Even Marta, the grumpy housekeeper, began to pause in the kitchen to listen. Something was shifting. Elliot watched from his study through the security monitors. First he watched out of curiosity, then confusion, then something closer to longing. He would mute his calls, delay meetings, just to hear that song that rolled like wind through the halls. One night he turned off the sound altogether, just watched Grace hold his mother's hand and sing to her, gently brushing back Eleanor's wispy hair. He didn't understand why, but it made something ache. On the 12th night, Eleanor moved her head, just slightly, barely enough to be noticed. Grace saw it and froze mid-song. Slowly she set the hairbrush down and whispered, "Was that you, Miss Eleanor?" There was no answer. But her head had turned an inch. Her chin tilted not toward the window this time, but toward Grace. Excited, Grace ran to find Marta, but the woman just crossed her arms and grunted, "Don't get your hopes up. Sometimes her muscles twitch. Doesn't mean anything." But Grace wasn't convinced. She returned to the room with even more determination. "You remember something, don't you?" she whispered. "You remember the song?" Elliot saw it too. He rewound the footage 4 times. watched his mother shift. Something clicked in his mind. He hadn't visited her room in years, not since the night she collapsed. But now he found himself standing outside her door, fingers hovering over the doorknob, unsure whether he was ready to face the woman who raised him, or the guilt buried beneath years of absence. That night, just past midnight, Eleanor opened her eyes wide for the first time. Grace had fallen asleep beside her in the chair, a book slipping from her lap. The house creaked softly with age, and outside, rain tapped gently against the windows. Eleanor blinked once, then again. Her lips trembled, then stilled. Suddenly, the door creaked open. It wasn't Marta. Elliot stepped in, drawn by something he couldn't name. He stood silently watching his mother. She was awake, but not speaking, not crying. Simply present. He stepped closer, his expensive shoes quiet on the carpet. Eleanor's eyes moved just slightly and, for the first time in years, looked directly at him. He froze. She stared at him blankly, as if he were both familiar and foreign. He whispered, "Mom." No answer. But she blinked. It wasn't much, but to Elliot, it was more than he'd had in a decade. And Grace, still dozing in the chair, hadn't seen any of it. In the morning, Eleanor was as still as ever. Grace felt foolish for hoping. But when she reached for the record player, she noticed something odd. The photo she'd placed on the nightstand of herself and her younger brother had been moved. Just slightly. She looked at Eleanor, puzzled. "Did you?" She didn't finish. Downstairs, Elliot sat in his father's old study, fingers running across dusty books. He hadn't told Grace what he saw. He didn't know how to. He was afraid it might disappear if he named it, but inside, his chest was a storm. Why now? Why her? Why had a stranger's voice done what he never could? The staff noticed his mood shift, canceled a business trip, took meals in the dining room again. Marta suspected it was the caregiver's influence, but didn't dare question him. The house, long frozen in sorrow, had started to thaw. But with the thaw came buried things. Guilt, regret, and secrets that whispered through the vents at night. Grace had been in the house nearly 3 weeks when she noticed the door across from Eleanor's room. It was always locked. Marta avoided it. Once, Grace tried the handle just curious, but it didn't budge. That evening, she asked Elliot casually during dinner, "What's in that room, if you don't mind me asking?" He looked up from his wine, startled. "It was my sister's," he said quietly. "She died, before my mother's stroke." Grace blinked. No one had mentioned a sister. Elliot's voice was strained. She was 17. "My mother never spoke again after the funeral. We tried everything." Grace didn't press further, but something inside her twisted. Eleanor hadn't just shut down because of illness. It was grief. A grief so heavy it had wrapped chains around her soul. And now Grace understood. She wasn't just trying to heal a broken body. She was trying to reach a locked heart. Grace could no longer shake the feeling that behind that locked door lay the key to Eleanor's silence and, perhaps, a reason strong enough to undo her. Late one night, she searched the living room for something to jimmy the lock. Marta's sharp footsteps caught her heart. Panicked, Grace hid the tools under her apron. Marta's shadow passed, but didn't stop. Grace realized desperation drove her. She would open that door, even if it meant breaking trust. With trembling hands, Grace managed to pick the lock the following evening. The door swung open to reveal a room frozen in time. Photographs, ribbons, school trophies, and a delicate pink dress hanging in the closet. In the center, on a small polished table, lay a letter sealed with Eleanor's signature. Grace opened it, and her entire world pitched sideways. Eleanor's words confessed guilt, regret, heartbreak at losing her daughter in a car accident. The stroke had been triggered by grief, by self-blame. Grace sank to the floor, softly reading the final paragraph. How Eleanor believed she punished herself by abandoning speech. How she thought she didn't deserve to speak until forgiveness came. The letter ended with a plea to find someone pure enough to walk her back into voice. Grace pressed it to her heart, tears pressing behind her lids. She understood now. This was her mission. To bring Eleanor back, not through techniques, but through love and song. Elliot found Grace standing outside Eleanor's room in the early morning, clutching the letter. She looked startled, vulnerable, pale as moonlight. He sighed, stepping closer. "You found it?" Grace nodded, voice catching. "She wrote it to me in her own hand."
Ow.
Elliot's throat tightened. He hadn't seen the letter.
I did.
He hadn't faced anything inside that room since the funeral. Now he did. They talked softly in the hall. Elliot confessed how he had avoided the locked room, how he was afraid it would break him. Grace described the letters, the longing, the self-hate, the belief that Eleanor should only speak when worthy. Across from him, Grace's eyes were steady, caring. He saw hope in her tone. "Can she find her voice again?" he asked. Grace took a breath. "I think we can help her, together." Elliot nodded. Shaken and uncertain, he extended his hand. Grace took it, feeling warmth and shared resolve. The silence between them collapsed. The mansion seemed to exhale. Two hearts, unknown allies, stood together to rebuild what grief had destroyed. That afternoon, Grace invited Elliot into Eleanor's room. He resisted at first, but stepped in as she touched the letter, folding it gently. They arranged chairs side by side beside Eleanor's rocking chair. Grace queued up a simple melody, a lullaby she'd been shaping to reflect Eleanor's story. As she hummed the opening notes, Elliot felt his chest tighten. Eleanor's eyes focused on Grace, at first uncomprehending, then curious, then drenched in emotion. Tears welled at the corners. Grace sang softly, weaving the themes of regret, loss, and the fragile tenderness of forgiveness. Elliot watched his mother tremble, her lips quiver. Then her scarred throat made a single sound. Grace. Grace paused, heart racing. Eleanor's voice, brittle and distant, had called her name. Elliot's breath caught. "Mom," he whispered. Grace resumed the lullaby gently, coaxing the words. Eleanor closed her eyes, tears streaming, and croaked, "Sing more." It was tiny but monumental. Eleanor's voice returned in shards over the next days, a syllable here, a whimper there. Each emergence brought tears and fatigue. Grace paced around her like a devoted gardener tending a delicate bloom, while Elliot hovered, torn between faith and pain. He confessed one afternoon in the garden, "I've spent years trying to fix things with money, solutions, doctors, but never like this." Grace didn't reply. She only continued humming Eleanor's lullaby as dusk settled. Night after night, Elliot stayed behind to listen. The lullaby became their ritual. Grace's song, Eleanor's fragile voice, and Elliot's silent vow. Something was shifting.
Ow!
Something deeper than money, deeper than regret, deeper than pain. Was that we cannot numb loss without rediscovering love. On the 15th day, Eleanor collapsed mid-note. Grace found her limp, shaking, eyes glassy. She called for help, but Elliot reached her side first, cupping his mother's face. Grace knelt and continued humming as a siren wailed in the distance. Time blurred. They rode together in silence to the emergency, where doctors swarmed. Grace waited in the hallway the whole night, Elliot beside her, running a hand through his hair. She barely slept. She barely breathed. When a nurse emerged at dawn, Grace's stomach dropped. The nurse whispered, "She's stable." But barely. This may have been the cost of reawakening the soul. Grace stared, trembling. Elliot wrapped her in a hug. Their unspoken grief bound them even tighter. Eleanor remained unconscious for 5 days. Grace sat by her side, holding her mother's hand. Elliot alternated between boardrooms and the hospital. He stopped answering calls, but not hospital texts. Grace hummed a lullaby without Eleanor's voice, her song filled with longing and fear. Every day, the doctors warned, "Don't overstimulate," yet every night Grace sang. On the 6th day, Eleanor stirred. A single tear rolled down her cheek. When Elliot and Grace rushed in, she seemed disoriented, but the spark was back. She opened her eyes and whispered, "Thank you for returning my voice." Wasn't singing, but it was raw, genuine, 1,000-pound weight lifted in a whisper. Elliot sank into the chair beside her bed. Grace held Eleanor's fingers in both her own. For the first time since she arrived, the estate felt like a home, the walls closing in with love, not emptiness.
Nowadays,
They exhaled together. When Eleanor was strong enough, Grace proposed therapist, speech, and music together. Elliot arranged appointments with top specialists. He stood beside his mother during visits this time. Grace guided her in singing. Slowly, Eleanor pieced together lines of the lullaby. Elliot wept at her first full verse. "Once more I breathe." At dinner, Eleanor shared fragments of memory. Her daughter's laughter, her husband's last promise, her endless guilt. Grace never once called her tragic, only human. Elliot listened in relief, heartbreak, and love. The house once buried in grief was now breathing stories, sharing secrets, forging connection. That night, Elliot admitted, "We could have done this years ago." He didn't blame Grace, he only blamed himself. Grace reached across the table, touching his hand. "We're doing it now," she reminded him, and it was enough. One afternoon, guests arrived, an attorney, two suited men. They asked to see Eleanor. Grace and Elliot exchanged cautious glances. The men presented papers. Eleanor's late husband had left an inheritance for his daughter, the missing sister. The estate, kept quiet, was to be transferred to a charitable trust managed by Eleanor. Once she resumed speech, Elliot looked at Grace. Eleanor looked at them. No sound. Then Eleanor's voice surfaced. "I remember." She spoke slowly, deliberately. As the lawyer rattled on, she told them. The money was not a burden. They would honor her daughter's memory by using it to care for others. Yes, but only when she was ready. She looked at Elliot. "Soon, my son, soon." It was the first time Eleanor had spoken about her daughter. The man who invested fortunes faltered, both tears and pride knotted his throat. Grace taught Eleanor a fresh song when she'd written about memory, forgiveness, and the beauty of rekindled voices. Day by day, Eleanor sang more. She even hummed in her sleep. Elliot listened with reverence. He told Grace he'd invest in music therapy programs inspired by what he'd witnessed. Grace responded with a quiet, hopeful smile. But shadows remained. In Eleanor's eyes, he saw flickers of doubt. Could she hold her voice? Did she want to? One night, she told them both, "My voice, it's reborn, but fragile. If I lose it again, the grief will drown me." Grace squeezed her hand. Leah leaned in. They promised to protect that delicate ember together. The lullaby, Grace's lullaby, was evolving. It wasn't just a healer. It was a vessel for transformation. Something neither had expected. A new song for all three souls. A year after Grace arrived, tensions returned. Eleanor's voice was stronger, but her health was not. One evening, she coughed, clutching her chest. The panic hit all at once. Ambulance. Hospital. Grace raced alongside her. Elliot followed, heart pounding with guilt and fear. At the hospital, the prognosis was sobering. Complications from age had worsened. Eleanor might not recover. They needed to cherish what remained. Grace stayed with her, singing the lullaby low as Eleanor drifted between sleep and consciousness. At one point, Eleanor cracked. The voice. "It only stayed because I finally believed it deserved to." Grace choked back a sob. Elliot closed his eyes. Through the ordeal, Grace and Elliot held each other up. They realized this was then. Just about saving Eleanor's voice. It was about saving what she'd lost inside, that woman. Eleanor lived fully because they'd chosen to fight with song. When Eleanor returned home, still frail, she summoned Elliot and Grace for a conversation in the drawing room. It's a measured voice. She shared her plans. She wanted to establish a music studio in her daughter's Nama, place where elders and caregivers could come together in song. Elliot's jaw dropped. He hadn't expected that kind of generosity. Grace held her breath, unsure Eleanor was ready for such a step. Eleanor met Grace's eyes and said, "Your voice came to me. I will set more voices free." Grace felt tears sting, and Elliot swallowed hard. They realized care had become transformation, not only for Eleanor, but for an entire community. But the twist. Grace would run the studio. She, the caregiver who had uncovered music's healing. Elliot would fund, but Grace would lead. They agreed softly, in tears and hope. Their alliance had grown deep, like roots entwined. Music would breathe life beyond the mansion's walls, converted a wing of the estate into the studio. Eleanor's voice, steady, sweet, rich, led the opening session. Grace watched from the back as Eleanor sang a welcome piece. Caregivers, elders, and isolated souls filed in. Some cried, some hummed along. One lonely man began sobbing, unable to find words but finding release in melody. Elliot quietly watched Grace's dedication. He realized then. His world had shrunk to deals and spreadsheets. This was living. He approached Grace after the ceremony and quietly said, "I've never been more proud to stand beside you." She smiled, surprised. He added, "To stand beside us." She nodded. The studio's first day ended in applause and a standing ovation, tears wiped, hearts connected. Eleanor, frail but radiant, embraced Grace and Elliot. They were a team, forged in song and love. Success didn't erase doubt. Grace found herself wrestling with imposter syndrome. Could she lead? Elliot worried about finances, sustainability. Eleanor doubted if she had enough voice left. One night, Grace sat in the empty studio with Elliot. They talked in circles, both hesitant to burden the other. Grace broke down. "I just want to help Mom, but I'm scared I'll fail." Elliot hugged her fiercely. "You're not alone." He admitted he felt helpless outside of the boardroom. They realized that teamwork meant leaning on each other's strengths. Grace's heart, Elliot's resources, Eleanor's voice. They forged a new pact, shared leadership, shared failures, shared nights of doubt. And they ended it with a promise tomorrow they'd sing again together. One evening, a man in a crisp suit visited the lawyer for a corporate partnership. He offered large funding if the studio accepted a private sponsorship that included naming rights and promotional events. Elliot saw its benefits. But Grace recoiled. Eleanor hesitated. The offer smelled of strings attached. Elliot sat Grace down. "We need this for reach." Grace's eyes flashed. "At what cost?" "We have to compromise our mission," Eleanor spoke quietly. "I want help, but not at price of soul." Elliot looked at his mother, and Grace realized he had taken her side. The contempt she felt melted into gratitude. They decided no corporate sponsorship. Instead, they'd focus on community fundraising. Elliot would donate anonymously. Grace would solicit local musicians. Their conviction strengthened. Building this project, his way no shortcuts, no compromises. Their unity was reborn. A fierce storm battered the estate one night. Rain pummeled rooftop windows. The power went out. In the dark, Eleanor panicked. Grace found her bedside, covered her with shawl, and began humming the lullaby. Elliot found candles and blankets. Thunder rolled. The storm shook windows. But as Grace sang, Eleanor closed her eyes and leaned in. Instead of fear, peace flickered across her face. Grace's song cut through the thunder. Elliot joined with low hums. The storm grew softer, as if listening. Dine's first light, the family of three sat by the studio's front, watching sunrise through soaked gardens. Hands linked, soothed by melody, and united. Word of their studio spread. They began hosting outreach sessions, performances in local shelters, hospitals, even prisons. Grace led with humble confidence. Eleanor performed carefully chosen pieces. Elliot quietly directed logistics. Letters poured in. People touched, tears released, lost voices finding themselves. A frail man wrote, "Your song saved my wife from despair." A woman confessed that releasing her voice ended a decades-long silence. Grace and Eleanor sat together, reading them. They both realized. Healing rippled outward, wider than the mansion gardens, deeper than they had imagined. Elliot watched them, chest swelling with pride. But his greatest pride was this, that their family, broken, had become the heart of something bigger. The ripple was theirs to nurture. On the one-year anniversary of Eleanor's first spoken word, they hosted a grand performance in the studio. Invitations sent, chairs filled. Grace stood backstage, breath unsteady. Eleanor, seated center stage, held Grace's hand. Elliot, in suit, scanned the room, journalists, neighbors, supporters. Grace began the performance. The lullaby, reworked into a full arrangement. Eleanor then sang her daughter's favorite hymn. Elliot stepped forward, delivering a heartfelt speech. This is not just a studio. It's proof that voices can heal, that dignity can be restored, that family can be reborn through song. By the final chord, the audience rose, applause pounding. Grace and Eleanor embraced, tears flowing. Elliot wiped his eyes. Lights dimmed. But inside, their light burned brighter than ever. A few months later, Eleanor announced an offer wealthy benefactors wanted to replicate their model. She planned to gift away the estate and convert it into a senior center, leaving the studio to a trusted board. Grace and Elliot stared in disbelief. Eleanor smiled gently. This home held sorrow. It must now hold hope. They cried together. Grace worried about losing what was built here. Elliot felt panic at the scale of change. But Eleanor's voice, calm and strong, soothed them. The legacy is not in walls. in voices. They made a pact to continue the mission wherever they went. The estate went on the market. The studio was donated. Grace received the leadership role at the newly formed trust. Elliot oversaw expansion. Eleanor continued visiting, singing, mentoring, and they all knew this chapter had ended, but the song would live on. Grace, Elliot, and Eleanor gathered for their final evening in the house. They sat in the empty parlor, sipping tea, humming little parts of the lullaby. Shadows from the fireplace danced. They reminisced. First night, first word, first performance, first storm. They spoke of fears overcome and gifts discovered. They stood in a circle, hand in hand, and sang softly. Their voices intertwined, echoing from one room to the next. The house, now empty, seemed to breathe with them. No one spoke of tomorrow's move. It was enough to be here now, in harmony. When the song ended, Eleanor whispered, "Let's carry this wherever we go." Grace and Elliot nodded. Their hearts brimmed with sadness and hope, sorrow and joy. The beautiful mix of life and song. Months later, Grace stood on a small stage in a new community center. Beside her, Eleanor, older, weaker, but radiant in voice. Elliot watched from the audience, a quiet smile etched across his face. The room filled with caregivers, elders, newcomers, their voices joined, humming, crying, singing. Grace led the lullaby's opening notes. Eleanor picked up the full melody this time. The audience joined. Grace looked down at her hands, ... and lifted her gaze. She saw Elliot and Eleanor in harmony. She felt every soul present, every heart healing. That evening, the lullaby ended. The audience stayed silent for a long count. Then applause, tears, connection. Grace smiled and her soul soared. She realized they had started with one voice in the darkness, and now thousands sang to light the way forward. The title of their story had changed from Caregiver and Patient to Family and Legacy. And as the lights dimmed, Grace whispered to Eleanor, "It's just the beginning." Please subscribe to our YouTube channel for more exciting videos like this. Thank you for watching.